Okay, thank you again. I see that there are people still coming in, but in out of respect for all of you, who have arrived on time, we're going to get started, and we have a wonderful program in store. My name is Melissa Rosen. I am the Director of Training and Education at Sharon, and thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar as we start the closing of the 2024 Sharon Summit. This webinar, Sharon's Book Club, The Amen Effect, with Rabbi Sharon Brous, part of the summit, which brings together thousands of people virtually and in person across the country and beyond, started on October 9th, and it is ending in just a couple of days on November 10th. The Sharon Summit is a source of the latest information on breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and we encourage you to visit our summit website and check out the virtual toolkit. And the link to that will be in the chat box in a second. I do want to take a moment to thank the Sharon Summit sponsors: AstraZeneca, Daiichi Sankyo, Merck, Novartis Oncology, Pfizer, City of Hope, AZI, Northwell Health Cancer Institute, and RMA New York, Long Island. Additionally, thanks to the many summit program partners, that you saw in the opening slides. Their partnership has truly helped make our summit a success. A couple of housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on Sharon's website alongside a transcript. Participants' faces and names will not be in the recording. If you would like to remain private, you have that option. You can turn off your video and rename yourself, or you can call into the webinar. Instructions on how to do that are in the chat box now. I'm happy to say we also have closed captioning available. To display live captions, on the bottom of your screen, click Captions and then Show Captions. You may have noticed you were muted upon entering Zoom. Please stay muted on the call, and please feel free, you're encouraged to type your questions and comments into the chat box. We will have plenty of time to address them with Rabbi Brous toward the end. And finally, as we move on into the webinar itself, I want to remind you that Sharon is a national not-for-profit cancer support and education organization and does not provide any medical advice. The information provided by Sharon is not a substitute for medical advice. You should not use this information to treat a health problem. Okay, I'm going to have Rabbi Brous join me. We are so honored to be joined today by Rabbi Sharon Brous. Rabbi Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of Ikar, a leading-edge Jewish community based in Los Angeles. She's a graduate of Columbia University, both undergraduate and an MA in human rights. And she was ordained by JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and lives in LA with her husband and children. And of course, Rabbi Brous is the author of the best-selling The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World. This book is fundamentally about the importance of community as we navigate moments of crises, about the importance of, as she says, being wrapped in the embrace of a community. And as I read it, I could not help but think about how that is really what Sharon is and what Sharon does. And that made me so proud. Today, Rabbi Brous will share about the beautiful concepts she writes about and how the Amen Effect, both the book and the concept, can impact our lives positively. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much. And thank you, Deborah and Abigail and the whole team over there. I'm really thrilled to be with you. I have to say, as the room started populating, it really moved me just to be in the presence of so many wonderful Jewish women. So thank you for having me. I have been really deeply moved by the work of Sharon for many years now and have lots of loved ones who have connected with the organization in their deepest hour of need and found great comfort. And so I'm very personally moved and grateful. to the organization and to all of you, and happy to be part of this conversation with you now. So what I'm going to do is take a step back and share with you the big idea of the Amen effect. And then Melissa and I will be in some conversation, and then hopefully others who are with us on the call today will join, and we can really be in dialogue together. And even Melissa, as you were reading the title of the book, I thought, I subtitled the book Ancient Wisdom to Mend Our Broken Hearts and World. We so desperately need healing right now, healing in our bodies, healing in our spirits, healing in our communities, and healing in the country. So I hope, and my hope and prayer in this conversation is that somehow there's some measure of comfort that comes into the world as I share some of these ideas with folks. So the central premise of the book, really the central organizing principle of the book, is a Mishnah, ancient Jewish code of law codified around the year 220 CE. This was a fairly obscure Mishnah that I first encountered when I was a rabbinical student in New York City in the late 90s. And I remember sitting at my dining room table in my apartment in New York and staring at this text, which I came across by accident while looking for something else. And I was just bewildered by this short text. I could not make sense of it. It seemed too simple, too obvious. There was something else going on here. I was really struggling to figure out what the deeper meaning of it was. I literally went and photocopied this text and folded it up and put it back in my Mishnah and back on the shelf. Then I moved out to Los Angeles, started to build our community Ikar out here in LA. I experienced some life, some love, some loss, some illness, navigated the things that a pulpit rabbi navigates with lots of beautiful community members, really experienced brokenheartedness, both my own and other people's. I actually got really invested in a big burgeoning conversation around loneliness at this time, because I started to notice that more and more people were coming into my office and sitting down and just bursting into tears and apologizing, as one does, even though you're not supposed to apologize in a rabbi's office for crying, and saying, I just don't know what my purpose is. I don't know who my people are. I feel like I'm dying from loneliness. And I heard it so many times that I started to read the literature around loneliness. At that time, which was about 15 years ago, there was one book that became kind of a seminal book on loneliness by a researcher called Dr. John Cacioppo, in which he said that loneliness has as devastating an impact on the human body as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, that's the equivalent of the impact on our heart and on our lungs. And I was just stunned by this because I saw the impact of loneliness on our spirits. I saw the impact of loneliness, and now I was starting to understand the impact of loneliness on our bodies. And really at the same time, I was reading Hannah Arendt and started to recognize the danger of loneliness in our society. What happens to people when we feel so alone, how we distance and retreat from one another, and how we create the space for, when we do so, for more extreme thinking and conspiracy theories and all the like. And so I recognized that here was this spiritual pain that had an impact on our hearts, both spiritually and physically, and also had this profound impact on our society. And as I was mulling all of this over, I happened to pull that Mishnah off the shelf again. And when I did, that piece of paper came fluttering to the ground, and I picked it up and said, oh my God, I remember this. And I looked at it, and honestly, I understood it immediately. I knew exactly what it was that the rabbis were trying to say to us 2,000 years ago. And I recognized that in some way, this was maybe the most powerful response to the crisis of loneliness, which now in our time, the Surgeon General calls an epidemic of loneliness. So I'm going to describe to you the ritual that the rabbis paint for us from the Mishnah. And this is Mishnah Midot 2:2 for those who are going to follow along. And actually, in the back of the book, I include the Mishnah in the original, so you can find it there as well if you have a copy of the book with you. what the rabbis describe is that when Jews used to go up to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem on sacred days, whether that was on a pilgrimage, the day of a pilgrimage festival, or any other day, but in my own mind, I always imagine it on the pilgrimage festival days because those are most vivid, I think where you could imagine the ritual most vividly. So hundreds of thousands of people used to come from all across the land, and they would make their way up to Jerusalem, which is, of course, a city on a hill, as we know. They would ascend the steps of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the holiest place in the holiest city on the holiest days. And then they would enter through one of these giant, beautiful arched entryways. And they would turn to the right and they would circle around the perimeter of the courtyard. So now you have to imagine hundreds of thousands of people circling en masse around this courtyard and then exiting right where they came in. Except the text says, Misha erodavar, someone to whom something had happened, someone who was sick, someone whose loved one was sick, someone who had just lost a loved one and was grieving, someone who was deeply worried or anxious, someone who was lonely. That person would walk in the same entryway as everyone else, but whereas everyone else turned to the right, this person would turn to the left. And as they made their way around, they would meet one another. And here's where the sacred encounter would occur, in which somebody who's coming from the right would look into the eyes of the bereft, the bereaved, the ill, and they would ask this very simple question, which is, Ma lach, tell me what happened to you. It's interesting because the language in the original is malach, which is now sounds to our ears like the feminine form. If you look in some versions, it'll say malacha, but actually the original was malach. Tell me what happened to you. What happened to your heart? And that person would answer. They would say either, I just got a diagnosis, or I am worried sick over my kid, or I feel like nobody in the world understands me, or my father just died and I'm upside down about it. And the person who engages them, who's coming from this direction, would hear them, would take in what they say, and then would respond with a blessing. They would say something like, may the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult chapter. And then they would move on. And once they finished their circle, they would both leave through the same exit. I realized as I re-encountered this text, now having experienced some of life and death myself, and having experienced many, many people sitting in the, in the chair in my office, telling me about their own broken hearts and about their own loneliness and about their own struggle for meaning in their lives, I realized that the profundity of this text and what makes it really an eternal text is that what the rabbis are doing is calling people into a sacred encounter at precisely the moment that neither party wants to actually engage. Because as many of you know and have experienced in your own lives, I think as all of us have on some level experienced, when we are the bereft, the bereaved, the ill, sometimes getting out of bed is an act of heroism, right? Sometimes even just leaving the house is very, very hard to do. I'm not even talking about physically, I'm talking about spiritually and emotionally. Being willing to show up in a place where literally the whole world's walking in one direction and you're walking in the other is like too much to ask. And yet that's exactly what the rabbis ask of people who are struggling in that way. And for the people who are coming, who turn to the right and are circling in that direction, I think we can all put ourselves into those shoes as well. And probably at some point in our lives, we have also been in that position. Those people were there because it was the most powerful spiritual experience of their lives to go on pilgrimage to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Literally, Jews would come from all over the world, the diaspora and from the land, to try to get there to have that experience. And as I was researching for the book, I read a lot of firsthand accounts from Muslims who went on the Hajj to try to understand, because it's the best kind of contemporary analog to what our ancestors experienced there. And what's so powerful about it is how similar people's testimonies are about that experience. Just masses and masses of people. In their case, they have millions. In our case, we had hundreds of thousands. And they describe just falling apart as soon as they arrive, crying, bursting into tears, falling to the ground. Their body gives out. And they say to just be wrapped up in that massive humanity is one of the most powerful human experiences that we can have. And now imagine that you're in the midst of that and you see some brokenhearted person who's walking toward you, who's puffy red eyes and doesn't seem well. The last thing in the world that you would instinctively do is peel away from this profound, powerful spiritual experience and walk up to a stranger and say, hey, what's going on with your heart? Tell me your story. And yet the rabbis say that's exactly what we're called to do. And what I learned from this is that it's precisely at the moment that our instinct, both the person walking to the left and the people walking to the right, is to retreat from each other. It's at precisely that moment that actually we are called to turn toward each other instead of turning away from one another. And what would it mean if we applied that ancient wisdom not only to when somebody is well or unwell, bereaved or not bereaved, but what if we apply that wisdom to all of our experiences in our lives? When we see someone who's hurting or someone who seems vulnerable or someone who's struggling in some way, and we really, really want to just keep having our lunch meeting that we're in, or to keep enjoying the time with our friends who finally gotten together and we haven't seen each other in a year, but instead we're pulled away to tend to the broken heart of another. And what would it mean if precisely when we feel least like engaging, because we don't know how we'll be received if we show up because we're struggling or we're unwell, if that's exactly the moment that we step into the fray and we trust that we are going to be held with tenderness and with compassion and with care. So from that principle, so many possibilities emerge, right? One question that I got a lot over the course of the last year and a half, because I'll tell you, I wrote the book. I closed the manuscript about 10 months before October 7th. My father died at the end of August, and I became an Avela, an official mourner. It was the first immediate family member that I had lost. Then just over a month later, October 7th happened. And then I went into the recording booth about a month after that to record the audiobook. And I was terrified because I hadn't actually looked at the manuscript in full since I turned it in. For those of you who've written, you sort of put it, you turn it in, and then you like clean your hands of it and jump back into the rest of your life. And I sat down in the audio room to record, and I was terrified because I was now literally a person walking to the left while I was counting on my community and our broader community to hold me from the right. And I wondered, does it still work? Does the idea hold up? And as I read the words, I started to cry because I realized actually that the rabbis were so wise. Of course, they weren't just writing from one perspective or the other. They really understood what it means to be a person who's able to give love and care because you have a little bit of extra strength in you. And they understood what it is to be a person who needs a little bit of extra love and care because you're going through a really difficult and painful chapter. And I felt so grateful to our ancestors that 2000 years ago, they wrote about this ritual because they gave us this gift that now became the lens through which I navigated my father's death and our post-October 7th reality. I can tell you that many times when I went on the road, the book came out in January, I was asked when I spoke in Jewish venues specifically, by so many people, I was asked, what happens when everybody turns to the left? Who holds us then? When everybody you know is grieving or mourning, so then who holds you? And I do address that question in chapter 1. Of course, I never could have imagined that it would be asked in this way. But at the end of chapter 1 of the book, where I lay out this idea, I share the story of a terrible loss that happened in our community. There was a terrible car crash. A drunk driver hit a family, very dear friends of mine, and both of the children were killed in the car. This was a totally shattering, horrific loss. It still is. And we navigated the loss as a community as best we could, trying to hold these beautiful parents. And 6 months after Ruby and Hart died, after these beautiful kids died, there was another terrible loss in the community. And I remember, because I was in Tel Aviv at a simcha, my niece's bat mitzvah, and I got the call that we had lost another young person in the community in a horrific freak accident. And I knew I had to call the family, Ruby and Hart's parents, whose names are Gail and Colin. Some of you might know them. They live here in LA. And I just couldn't let them read this news in an email. And so I called them and I shared that there had been this terrible loss. And I was so, so sorry. They didn't know the other family. They were all members of ICAR, but they didn't know the other family. The first thing that Gail and Colin said to me was, listen, please tell the parents that when they're ready, they can call us. We're right here, and we'll do whatever we can to help them. And I realized in that moment, it's very much like actually the kind of unofficial group of breast cancer survivors that we have at ICAR, and in so many communities, and here, where there are people who've experienced heartache and struggle, and are so willing, nevertheless, to step forward and turn and see who else is in need of love and care. And it's not only once somebody's made it to the other side, it's very often someone who's still in the midst of their own treatment or of their own grief. And I've seen it now so many times that I feel like this is a spiritual phenomenon, that in some ways we understand in our suffering that there is meaning in helping others who are similarly struggling and suffering. Since then, I've learned that this is really central to AA also, that many people who are in Alcoholics Anonymous talk about that part of their journey toward recovery is helping other people who are one step or more behind them in the recovery process. And I think there's something very powerful about the human heart, that even when we're still walking to the left, we have the capacity with our capacious hearts to turn and see who else is also on that journey, and to give them love and support as we do. So that's a very powerful learning that I've encountered along the way. We enacted the ritual in real time in our community at ICAR in February of this past year. And what I did was I asked, there were about 700 people in the room, and I asked everyone to stand up if they could, and to go to the perimeter of the room. And if they were doing okay that night, if they really felt like they had a little bit of extra strength in them, they should go to this wall and they should start to circle around to the right. And if anybody in the room was unwell, if they had received a diagnosis, if they were grieving the death of a loved one, that they should go with me to the left, with me, because I was in the year of mourning for my father. And then we would stop and we would engage each other and we would offer blessings. And it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life to actually watch the enactment with hundreds and hundreds of people in the room of this ancient ritual. I would say about 50 people walk this way and 650 people walk this way, which is pretty good. I happen to know some of the folks going this way also weren't doing so great, but they felt like they had a little extra in them and they could. And because I was walking to the left, I was stopped by several people who were strangers, who looked me in the eye and said, Malach. And I said, I'm grieving the death of my father. And I'm so worried because right after he died was the High Holy Days. And right after that was October 7th. And I just don't know when I'm going to grieve. And strangers gave me blessings that they made up with their own words. And I realized then that even this isn't even in the book, that what part of what's so powerful about the ritual is that people don't go to the Temple Mount to get blessed by the priests, by the Kohanim. They don't go to get blessed by the rabbis or by the scholars or by the leaders of the community. They go to get blessed by each other. And this is such a powerful reminder that we all have the power to bless one another, and that we can actually give each other the gift of seeing one another in our pain and seeing one another in the fullness of our humanity and holding each other with compassion and with love. And I really feel in this time of so much brokenheartedness that that might be the most beautiful gift that we can actually give each other. In chapter 8, and Melissa, I'll share one more piece and then we'll go into, I'm eager to hear your questions. In chapter 8 of the book, I really explore for the first 7 chapters various dimensions of what it means to learn to hold compassion, to find the courage to show up and to hold compassion when you see someone who's found the courage to show up, and how that can be one of the most powerful responses to loneliness in our society. The willingness to be seen and the willingness to see each other deeply. And in chapter 8, I explore the last piece of this Mishnah, which I will share very briefly, which is the Mishnah actually gives 2 examples of people who turn to the left when they enter that sacred space. The first is the Avel, the mourner, from which I extrapolate anybody who's brokenhearted. But the second example that they give is the Menudeh, someone who's in Nidui, which was an ancient category of punishment, is someone who has harmed the community in some way. They've either harmed either in word or in deed. This is one step short of excommunication. So they're still in the community, but you're not supposed to even go within 6 feet of them. You're supposed to socially distance from them for a specific period of time, hopefully so that they will be awakened to the pain that they've caused, and then they can re-enter into relationship. So we don't invite them for Shabbos dinner. They don't come to your minyan. We're not allowed to do business with them. And yet, on the holiest days of the year, they go up to the holiest place in the world, in the holiest city in the world, and they enter through the same entryway and they turn to the left like the bereaved. And when we encounter them, we ask them, Malach, tell me what happened to you. We ask them with a truly curious heart. And they answer saying, Ani menudeh. I have done something that has caused my alienation from this community. And when we hear that, we don't kick them or shove them away or sidestep them or avert our eyes. We bless them. In the Mishnah, the language, there's a machloket, there's a dispute between 2 rabbis, one of whom says that we bless them, that the community should open their heart to them again so that they might be embraced back in the fold of the community. The other one says, well, we bless them, they should realize the pain that they've caused so that then they can be re-embraced in the fold of the community. But either way, they get a blessing. And what struck me there is that we are actually being called to imagine by our rabbis, not only how can we open our hearts in compassion and curiosity toward those who are coming toward us, who are brokenhearted or broken-bodied in some way, but how can we open our hearts in compassion and curiosity even to someone who's coming at us, someone who may have harmed us with ideas that are contrary to ours, or have said words or posted memes or images that we find painful? Can we also turn to them with a questioning heart and say, Malach, tell me what the world looks like from your vantage point, and I'll tell you about mine? Can we also give them a blessing? And what would happen to our communal and familial and national discourse if we were able to actually turn to one another in such a loving and powerful way? And that, I think, is the spiritual call of our time. Can we muster up the compassion and the curiosity to actually see each other in the fullness of our humanity? And what kind of healing might come to our broken hearts if we're able to? So thank you so much for being here. And I'm eager to be in conversation with all of you about this.
Thank you so much. I've read the book twice, and now even hearing you speak is such a joy and has my mind racing with ideas. So I do want to start a conversation with you, and we have some questions here. But if you have any questions or comments as a group, please put them into the chat now. We'll be checking them. But let's get started. So in your book, you speak about the Amen effect and longing for connection as a spiritual strategy. Can you elaborate what you mean by spiritual strategy and how those strategies might help us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes we treat loneliness and disconnectedness and social alienation kind of just as social problems, which can be remedied with social remedies. But I really see them as spiritual problems, and they need a spiritual remedy. I think at the heart of spirituality is the need to see and to be seen. by another. And even in the most powerful prayer experiences that I have, those part of that prayer, part of what makes prayer powerful for me is the need to be seen by the Holy One, the need for me to see and understand and encounter the Holy One in some way, and also my need to see and connect and be seen by other humans who are also striving, who are also brokenhearted, who are also longing and yearning and struggling. Some are grieving, some are celebrating. You know, something that I speak about a lot in the book, and that we encounter a lot at Ikar, is the idea that if you are spiritually awake, there's always there's always pain around you. There's always human heartache around you, and there's always also joy. And actually, our hearts are capacious enough to hold both of those things. And in fact, you know, it says in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, it says like there's a time for mourning and a time for dancing. And there's this incredible Yudah Amichai poem that some of you may know, where it says the Kohelet got that wrong. We don't actually have enough time to mourn and then time to dance. We have to do it all at once. We have to grieve and dance all at once. And it's so powerful, for me to think about the fact that if you go to any shul on Shabbat morning, go to any, you know, synagogue service or church service, and what you will find in that room, if you're awake to it, is that there are people who've just fallen in love for the first time in the room. And there are people who are just going through a divorce and it's tearing them apart. There are people who know that they're going to need to go through a divorce and they're not even there yet, right? In every room, there are people who just got a clean scan, and then there are people who know that something's just not right. We're constantly in a living community. We're constantly experiencing both loss and also love and life and death. And so what we can do is we can either compartmentalize it and try to shut out the joy because we're right now focused on grief, or shut out the grief because we're focused on joy, or we can just recognize that we're human beings. And Yudah Amichai is right. We don't have time to do one now and then the other tomorrow. We actually have to do it all now and be fully present for both as we do. That is a kind of spiritual awareness. And so that comes out of connecting with other human beings. If we're isolating ourselves, or if we've been in isolation, then we're only cognizant of our own spiritual reality, right? But if we allow ourselves to be in real relationship with others, then we bring our own pain to the place of someone else's joy, and we actually can hold both. I share in the book a story, one of the stories that happened to me, in which one of my beautiful cousins was in her final days of life, and she suffered really terribly, and she was very young, and it was awful. And it was my son's bar mitzvah. And the whole family convened for the bar mitzvah, and when we saw each other, we just wept and hugged each other, and we cried and cried. And then one of my relatives said, "Okay, no more tears. Now we focus on Levi. Now it's about Levi's bar mitzvah, and we're celebrating." And I just was up all night feeling sick over that, because I thought, I'm not putting Nancy in a box and putting her away for the weekend. She's in her final days of life. I want to be fully aware of that as I celebrate Levi. And I know that I can do both. And I just brought her presence right into the bar mitzvah and felt like this is it. Like this is about life and death and love and loss. And it's all present in this space. And it didn't diminish our simcha, our joy at all. In fact, I think it only made it possible for me to be even more present, because I understood the very preciousness of life. That is the spiritual dimension, to engaging in real human connection, not closing out other people's experience or parts of our own, and instead making space to hold it all.
Wow, thank you for that. I have another question here that you sort of answered, preemptively, but when you speak about joy and suffering together, in the book, it reminded me that sometimes in our work at Sharsheret, we'll hear someone say, well, ultimately cancer was a gift. And as a survivor myself, that made me so uncomfortable. but you've reframed it here. And yes, there's still time for joy even when we're facing illness, and there's still time for, it doesn't, it's not, it was a gift or it was a tragedy. I guess what you're saying is that it's not an ox, or it makes sense that it can be both at the same time. And that is a surprising and fascinating way to reframe life-altering illness. So,
Melissa, thank you for sharing that, also about, about the experience that many people say that they have, and your own struggle with that. And I just read a book called Chasing Daylight, that was recommended to me, which I don't know if any of you have, if any of you have encountered, but it was written by a guy who had glioblastoma, which is the same cancer that my cousin died from, my cousin Nancy, who I just mentioned. And he was told he had 3 months, and he starts the book by saying, essentially, these were the best 3 months of my life. And it was the first time in his life that he actually slowed down enough to engage his family, his children. He had lunch with his wife twice in like 20 years. And then finally, when he got the diagnosis, it was like every day was about being with his wife and his kids. And I had the same reaction you had, right? Which is like, okay. I mean, I'm honoring his experience and also thinking really that, like, to frame it like that is challenging. But I'll share with you that I speak in the book about the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. The book, by the way, is written from Jewish wisdom, ancient Jewish wisdom, but it's really intended for a broad audience. And so lots of non-Jews, are reading it. And I think my proudest accomplishment was, at some point, I was number 3 in Christian inspiration on the Amazon list. So, which I wasn't striving for, but that was nice. So I share that, but also for many Christians resonate to these biblical stories
yeah.
as well, of course. So the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, and I used to sit with people pastorally, and we would talk about the struggle that somebody was in, and I'd share the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, and I would say often, like, that we don't ask for these struggles, these challenges, and we wouldn't take them, if we could choose. But you have to claim your blessing in the morning. Like, there will be a dawn, and when the dawn comes, it's our work to say, where's the meaning that has come from this? And I was speaking about it with a bereaved parent once, and she said to me, sometimes there's a pain that's so deep that there is no morning, that there'll be no new dawn. And then we figured out that the challenge is, like she said, I'm never going to escape the darkness of the death of my child. But the challenge is, can you find blessings then, even in the dark of night? Jacob got his blessing from the angel when the sun came up, but what if the sun never comes back up? Can you find blessings even in the dark of night? And I know we can. I know that we can find blessings even in the deepest darkness. And so that's part of, what we're talking about here. And if I may, I want to share something, that a Torah that I learned from my beloved friend Shifra, who I also speak about in the book, and I know has some friends in the Sharsheret, the broader Sharsheret world. She's this really kick-ass feminist in New York. So many of you might know her, I guess. So Shifra, she's one of my dear friends, and she fell in love with a guy named Michael. This was a late in life love. They were actually introduced by Vivian Silver, who was killed on October 7th. Vivian was best friends with both of them. They fell in love, and they were going to have the rest of their lives together. And then he was diagnosed, became very, very ill very fast. He was diagnosed with cancer. And so Shifra and I spoke a lot through his final chapter, and about how they slowed time and they were able to find joy in, like, even going on a small walk around the block, and even just sitting at dinner, before he would get too tired to leave the table. And she really had to try hard to find those moments, but they found those moments every day. And then after Michael died, Shifra called me and she said, it doesn't feel right for me to be like this widow in sackcloth and ashes for him. The reason I fell in love with him was because he filled me with joy. Like even when he was sick, he filled me with joy and he was the life of the party and he was hilarious and he was, and she said, I don't want to just sit here and cry for him for a year. I want to experience joy as part of my grief. So what she did was she set her alarm on her phone for 18 minutes a day, in which she forced herself to experience joy, even in the immediate aftermath of her partner's death. And she would do all kinds of crazy things like bake chocolate chip cookies and eat a cake and go for a walk in Central Park and call a friend who she knew would make her laugh and not feel guilty about it. Not feel guilty that she was having joy, even though her loved one had just died 2 weeks earlier. And she kept a log of it over the course of the year of what did she do today to experience joy for at least 18 minutes. And I have to say, I took it on in solidarity with her. Like I felt like I want to do that. I want to experience 18 minutes of joy in solidarity with Chip. But that was joy as an expression of her grief. And I know that we can do
Love that
that. And
concept.
I've come to find that joy is not some kind of luxury. Joy is a spiritual necessity. We must experience joy because our bodies and our spirits need that.
Joy is not a luxury. I'm putting that in the chat box right now because it just struck me so intensely. You speak about the importance for showing up for someone in a state of vulnerability, that the person showing up should be in a state of vulnerability. Can you speak a little more about what you mean by that? And for those what to do for those who find it difficult to be vulnerable. And I'll say from the perspective of Sharsheret, I think cancer is a scary word, and feeling vulnerable is very scary. It comes from a place of fear, not anger or anything like that, at least in the work that we do. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I read a really powerful book some years ago by a Catholic theologian called Henry Nouwen, who wrote about vulnerability and how healing can only happen when we're willing to share the part of us that's broken. And
Mm,
that's true both for the person who's struggling and not well, and also for the healer. So if I think that I'm going to sit in my chair as the rabbi and you're going to come in my office and share your pain and I'm going to make you feel better, we've got it all wrong. Because I have to also tap into my own vulnerability in order to actually see you and understand you and empathize with you. And if you think that you're going to come into the office and not reveal any of your vulnerability, but somehow get the magic dust from the rabbi or the therapist or the best friend, that's also wrong. You can feel better. You can feel temporarily better. Someone can distract you, but the healing comes when we're willing to expose where the pain is and we're willing to be seen as both bruised and beautiful, like we all are. And so I think it's very hard to do. And I understand what you're saying, Melissa. And my mom, who's here on the Zoom with us also, is a breast cancer survivor. And we talked a lot about vulnerability and invulnerability as she was going through her struggle with cancer. And what it means, like there's a sense that if I let down my guard for even a moment, then the cancer wins. And I understand, I really hear that. I hear it as much as a person who hasn't gone through it in my own body, but my most beloved, family member has. Um, and also I think we know what it feels like when somebody sees us when we're broken and doesn't run away and says, I love you, even in this state, and even with the brokenness, I see you and I love you and I see the beauty in you. And so I don't think we should walk through the world showing everybody our vulnerability. But I do think that we have to be able to access that ourselves and be willing to share it sometimes
yeah.
in order for that kind of really profound connection to happen.
Thank you for that. So somebody posted a perfect segue here. So if we do not have the opportunity to walk to the left, knowing that we will meet people who are walking to the right, how do we begin? So we're talking about vulnerability. This is a perfect, practical thing when it comes to vulnerability.
So I think I want to make sure I understand the question right, but I think what the person is asking is, what if we don't trust that we're going to be held with love by somebody who's coming in the other direction, right? Am I getting that right?
That seems like the solid interpretation. That's what I
Okay.
was assuming.
Right. Yes. And I mean, this is so painful and so important, but can we build relationships in our lives um, with, with a family member, with a friend, with a therapist, with a rabbi, with a book group, with other people who come to the Sharsheret convening, with people who we can grow to trust will hold us and not run away from us when we're in pain. Because I believe that we cannot navigate life's greatest challenges alone. I mentioned Gail and Colin before, whose kids were Ruby and Hart, and Colin wrote this beautiful book that I highly recommend that you pick up if you haven't already seen it, called Finding the Words. And it's about how he navigated um, the death of his children. And really, it's very beautiful. Colin's not Jewish. His wife and kids were Jewish. And he talks about how Jewish ritual actually saved him and really helped him figure this out. And I'll tell you, I've experienced this now many times with people who've suffered incredibly, terrible losses, where they've said that these rituals that Jews use, that sort of mark time for Jews and help us navigate times of grief, have saved their lives. But what Colin says is that you can't navigate grief alone. That to grieve means to be in dialogue with someone else. And sometimes that someone else is your loved one, and sometimes that someone else is your teacher or your, therapist, and sometimes it's the community. And I write in the book about how just the power of standing up in a room of even 9 strangers and saying Yitzgadal v'Yikadash Shemei Rabbah, and having 9 people say Amen, is being in community. It's actually allowing ourselves to be held tenderly in our pain. And so it's a heartbreaking question. And I think the answer is, part of our work in the world is to try to situate ourselves in relationships of care where we can be held by at least someone in this world with tenderness when we bring forward our honesty and our vulnerability.
No, thank you for that. I have so much more that I would love to ask you. I am aware of the time. We have 10 minutes left. We have a few concluding thoughts we want to share. So let me leave you with this one last question. In the last chapter of your book, you focus on social divisions and the tribalization of our society. And while that may be front of mind for many of us today, I do want to bring it back to cancer and illness in general. As those of us with a personal cancer experience are aware, a life-altering diagnosis changes our perspective. It makes us feel different. And in some cases, it can actually feel alienating. We are painfully aware of how we are all of a sudden, with those 3 words, you have cancer, different from those around us. So as we begin to wrap up, can you comment on how the lessons of your book are relevant to so much more than one might think about at first glance? And you've been doing this a little bit with everything you've said, but I think it would be a great concluding thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I maybe will answer that by referring back to something that Dory wrote in the chat here about bearing witness. And I'll share this idea because something that I have learned from just navigating life and death with a lot of people through really great hardship over the last 20 years since we built Ikar, is that in our culture, I think we often get wrong what our role is when we step forward to help somebody who's struggling or suffering. I think that we believe, and this is just this kind of American mindset, that our job is to fix it. That our job is to, like, we're going to pull somebody from their grief. We're going to lift them back up and make them better. And actually, our job is not to fix somebody. And we know this when we're sick, and we know this when we're grieving, that when somebody comes to us trying to fix us, unless they're our doctor, unless they're our oncologist or our mechanic, or our IT guy, we don't actually, like, that's not what we need from them. What we need is their presence and their love. We need them to bear witness, in the language that one of my community members who suffered a terrible loss said. He said that after the death of his child, so many people came to him, like friends from college. I mean, I have somebody who, by the way, told me that when her kid died, she had a friend from college who said, "You just need to cheer up." And, and this guy who told me that people literally would come to him and they're like, "Come on, man, let's go get a drink." And he's like, "I don't want to get a drink. I want to sit on my floor and cry. I just don't want to do it alone. I want you to do it with me." Right? Like, I don't want to be, in addition to being bereaved, also be lonely. I want you to sit beside me and cry with me. And he calls it bearing witness. And I love this idea. Like, can we bear to be with each other when
And
the other,
witness,
or
not
when we
witness.
are in so much pain? And I think that that challenge goes both ways. Can we let somebody in who can sit on the floor with us and weep? And, and can we, and can we find the willingness to just be in that discomfort? And there's this story that I share from the Gemara in the book, in the bearing witness chapter, about this rabbi who, it's a famous story, and you've probably heard of Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe some of you know it. So Rabbi Yochanan was this kind of magical healer, and when one of the rabbis was sick, he would go walk into their room, and he would sit beside them and say, "Do you want to be suffering this way?" And if they said no, he would take their hand and lift them up, either physically and heal them miraculously, or spiritually and kind of lift their spirits. And then one day he gets sick, and somebody comes and does the same for him, which shows that even this person who had the magical power, he needed someone else to do it with him. And that's where we get that expression, "A prisoner cannot free himself from prison," right? We need each other's support and love. But it's the next episode that's the most fascinating for me, because once he's well, he goes to the next guy who's sick. And he walks in the room and he says, basically, "I'm here to heal you." And the guy is just wailing and crying, and he won't get up. And Rabbi Yochanan's like, "What's the matter? Maybe it's because you're upset because you didn't learn enough Torah. Maybe you weren't rich enough. Maybe you didn't have enough kids. Maybe you didn't have like, he talks and talks and talks the way we do when we're supposed to be comforting somebody. But instead of listening, we just keep filling the space. And finally, the guy says to him, "I'm crying because we're all going to die. And I just can't, like, I'm sad about it." And Rabbi Yochanan sits down on the bed with him, and they just cry together. It's so tender. Like, our rabbis, this group of men in the Beit Midrash 2,000 years ago, wrote a story about, about the great Rabbi Yochanan learning how to bear witness with his friend who was just suffering and just needed someone to sit with him and say, "I'm just really so sad today." And what a powerful model for us of what we are called to do and what we're not called to do. We don't need to fix each other. We just need to be with each other and not run away when things get really hard.
That is a beautiful thought to end on, and a great reminder when we're talking about witness that November is actually Caregivers Awareness Month. And we have a couple of webinars coming up that I'd love to share with you. So the first one, or not the first one, but the first one I'm going to mention is on November 20th. And it is our caregiving webinar, talking about navigating dual roles, and it's geared toward partners who are cancer caregiving. There's a lot of types of caregiving. This year's happens to be about partner relationships. The link to register for that, if that's something you're interested in, is in the chat box now. And then November also happens to be Men's Health Awareness Month, and our annual Men's Health webinar is on the 13th. It's coming up very quickly. This year we're going to be focusing on reducing cancer risk in all men, and so the link for that is there. I want to remind you that my colleague Deborah has been posting a link periodically to purchase the Amen Effect. You can also get it through Amazon. And just a plug that this is an interesting book in that it's a quick read, but not because it's a simple read or anything like that. It's actually the opposite. But both times I read it, I just wanted to keep reading to hear the wisdom that was coming next. And it's I encourage you to find a way to read it. Okay, thank you again to our webinar partners and to our summit sponsors, AstraZeneca, Daiichi Sankyo, Merck, Novartis Oncology, Pfizer, City of Hope, AZI, Northwell Health Cancer Institute, and RMA New York and Long Island. We just put into the chat box a survey for tonight's program. Please take a second. You can click now and still hear our parting words. And remember, of course, that Sharsheret is here with you. We will sit in witness with you and your loved ones. We provide emotional support, mental health counseling, other programs to help design to help you navigate through your cancer experience. As a reminder, all are completely free, customized, and confidential. Our contact information is in the chat box right now. You are our priority. As we come to a close, let's put that SurveyMonkey link in one more time. Rabbi Brous, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your passion, your insights. You know, even as someone who's read it, talking to you made me think about things differently. And I feel very confident saying that anyone who was with us tonight feels the same way. And we're grateful for that.
Thank
So
you so
thank
much.
you. And
Thank
have
you
a
both.
wonderful evening, everyone. Good night.